If there's one thing that all woodworkers have in common, I'd put my money on the fact that regardless of whatever project they're working on, they're most likely eyeballing the next project. That said, it only seems natural that that next project will probably require a brand new tool. Now, I started this whole woodworking gig about 5 years ago, and for the longest time, that new tool for me was my SawStop cabinet saw. And once a SawStop table saw finally made its way to my shop, the next tools down the road quickly became my joiner and my planer. I think most people would agree that these are the big three that make up a woodworking shop, and after I finally had these three, I felt like the possibilities of new projects I could do was endless. So if you've ever done any woodworking before, I'm sure you'd agree that you're always eyeballing that next tool. And up until about a year ago, that next tool down the line for me was a big resaw capable bandsaw. So while the primary use of a big bandsaw might be for resawing or cutting out curves, the reason that I wanted one for so long was to have the capability of making pedestal tables. For whatever reason, the pedestal table just fascinated me with the way that that pedestal was cut out. And having no personal experience with making pedestal tables, this was something that I knew I really wanted to give a shot. So if you're a follower of my channel, or at least watched some of my previous videos, you may have seen where I made a couple really cool pedestal tables using the bandsaw. And if you're wondering how I plan to cut this non-symmetrical pedestal out on a bandsaw, you might be surprised to hear that this project has absolutely nothing to do with a bandsaw, but rather instead a lathe. So to make sense of how wanting a bandsaw for so long relates to this lathe, if you're familiar with Laguna, you know that they run a special sale on their bigger tools each year, about this time actually. It just so happens that the local shop I got these tools from had an even better deal if you bought 2 tools at once, and I wasn't able to pass up on it. So once I finally got these 2 tools home, I used the bandsaw almost immediately on that first pedestal table. But this lathe sat up against the wall for almost a year, and that's honestly because I had absolutely no idea how to properly use a lathe or to turn anything. If it wasn't obvious enough, I made pretty much no progress whatsoever with that first pass of the roughing gouge, and I tried to knock the corners down a bit with a router, but that also did nothing. So I thought the only option I had left was to cut this thing further down with the table saw to remove as much material as possible and hopefully turn this thing into a cylinder shape. Now if I'm being honest, I was a little bit intimidated with this part. Having never turned anything this big on a lathe, I wasn't sure how this would go. But at some point your only option is to just go for it. So that's exactly what I did. And alternating between the roughing gouge and an Easy brand rougher tool, to my surprise, this actually went pretty well. If you're someone who likes a takeaway or is looking for tips from that one guy on YouTube in these videos, unfortunately, I don't have much for you in terms of tips on turning on a lathe. In fact, if you're watching this and you're more experienced than I am, I'd love to hear some tips or input of anything that I might be doing wrong. Now, as far as creating the center pedestal goes, I found a picture of something that I wanted to try to make, and then I made lines where I thought each detail feature of that image would be. And as far as copying a design goes, I wasn't really too worried about it because I had somewhere in the range of 0% to negative 100% confidence that I would actually be able to get this thing to look exactly like the picture. I would be a liar if I said that I had never turned on a lathe before, because in my last video, I did turn the legs on this cabinet, which is a basic cylinder, the most simple design that there is. And while I didn't have too much trouble with that, this center pedestal is far more complex, and my end goal really was just to end up with something that was aesthetically pleasing. By no means would I say that it was easy to turn the end result of what you're seeing here, but I was surprised that I had as little difficulty as I did. And other than catching an edge here or there, and kind of modifying or shaping the entire pedestal as I went, it wasn't that bad. But one thing that I was surprised was how long it took me to sand this. Now, I don't know if there's a better method of sanding the pedestal down, or maybe I was just using the wrong grit of sandpaper, or maybe even something to do with the fact that this was hard maple, but I swear it almost took me just as long to sand all of the knife marks out as it did to turn the entire pedestal. Now, speaking of hard maple, it only took me about a minute to realize that cutting off the leftover section that the faceplate was attached to was less than enjoyable by using a handsaw, especially when you have power tools available. Now, usually whenever I'm doing a project, I try to start with the hardest part first to get it out of the way. And while the center pedestal is technically finished at this point, this build is far from over. And that's obviously because we have to build the rest of the table, but also because the rest of the table has to be attached to that pedestal. And the reason that this part is complicated is because this entire table has to be able to be taken apart, but also easily reassembled. And I'll explain the reason for this a little later in the video. For the bottom base of the table, I originally planned on continuing the circular look, but as I worked my way through the design, I ended up deciding on more of a classic look. And while these leg pieces will be cut later in the video, something about this layout just didn't look right to me. So as I dig through my scrap pile that I refuse to throw away, I want to know everyone's opinion on using plans for a design of something like this. Now, I don't have plans available for this table, so I'm not trying to sell you anything, but I can't help but wonder, if I would have had a detailed set of plans on this table before I started, I might not have had to change the design so many times. Now, as a woodworking YouTuber, I've got to admit that I watch other woodworking videos all the time. And one thing that I've noticed is that a lot of other creators are using SketchUp type plans or maybe some CAD type of design for their builds. Now, I'm not hating on anyone or trying to discredit anyone's work or workflow whatsoever. In fact, I even have several sets of build plans available on my Etsy site. But unless I'm trying to build something that's extremely complicated or I just don't understand whatsoever, I almost never use build plans on anything. So I'm not making this statement in a manner of saying that I'm a better woodworker than anyone or too good to use plans, but there's a part of me that would prefer to struggle through building something or make plenty of errors and mistakes until I finally understand exactly how to make that piece. And I'm not sure if this is because I'm too hard-headed and stubborn, or if it's more because I'm trying to understand the ins and outs and how everything truly works within this craft. So I'd obviously like to tell myself it's the latter of those options, but I'm not sure what the true answer is. Regardless, what's everyone's opinion on the use of plans? Or maybe a better question is, what's everyone's opinion on watching a video where someone draws up a set of plans and then completes the build from those plans? So earlier in the video, I said that this table will have absolutely nothing to do with the bandsaw. And based off of those cuts that I just made on the leg pieces, I guess that makes me a liar. But compared to some of the other cuts I've done on previous pedestal tables, these cuts were very simple. And still, I think the star of the show on this table is the center pedestal, which obviously was turned on the lathe. So at this point, we've got that center pedestal finished, and the very bottom base underneath that pedestal will just be assembled with dominoes, mainly because it's easier. To my surprise, this glue up was more challenging than I thought it would be, most likely just due to the awkward angles and the difficulty of getting those clamps in the right spot. So earlier I mentioned that this table will need to come apart, and that's true, but it's the pedestal that will need to be removable from this bottom rather than the legs coming off themselves. So for this reason, it was acceptable to just glue these legs right into place, giving us a very solid base for the table and the rest of the pedestal to set upon. If you hadn't noticed at this point, everything we've used is hard maple, so it only makes sense to make the upper section of the table out of hard maple as well. For overall aesthetic purposes of the table, we'll make the upper supports look somewhat similar to the bottom supports, but our main concern here on the top supports is actually supporting the table top rather than just how it looks. These two opposing grain pieces will be joined together with what's called a half lap joint, which, in my opinion at least, is the strongest type of joint that I could come up with for this application. I'm sure there are faster or more potentially efficient ways of doing half laps, but I found using the table saw to be very accurate in my last several builds. And if you're wondering why I don't swap the regular blade out for a dado blade to make this go quicker, well, that's just because I'm lazy. While strength and overall style are two of the benefits of using half-lap style joinery, we'll run into a couple concerns as well. One, which is completely avoidable or fixable, and the second, which unfortunately there's nothing we can do about. Unless, of course, we decide to get creative. Now, personally, I'd say it's not actually required to clean these joints up unless they'll be glued together. But gluing these boards together will introduce the problem of opposing grain directions, meaning that as these boards expand and contract, there could be structural issues with one of them cracking or the glue joint even breaking. And this is where we'll have to get creative. But before we get creative, we'll need to fix another problem. So whenever cutting half laps, it would obviously be best to make that middle cut at exactly halfway through the board, but this can be difficult to do. So rather than cut too far in the half lap joint, I like to make my center cuts just shy of half the distance and then use the planer to slowly cut down the opposite face, which might take several thin passes, but gets us to the exact thickness that we want. So as I mentioned before, and with these two arrows that I'm probably drawing too light on the screen to see, the grain is running in opposite directions. So rather than use glue, we'll use furniture bolts to connect these pieces. The use of these furniture bolts will surprisingly solve two of our problems at once. And those two problems are simply just how to attach these two pieces together allowing for wood movement, and also how to make the frame or the base of this table detachable, or in simpler terms, just mean that it can come apart. So if you're curious how using these furniture bolts is any different than glue or screws that would hold everything together, let me explain. Rather than just pre-drill a hole that a normal screw would go in, we'll cut elongated slots using the domino. And the bolts themselves won't actually move, but rather that movement represents the freedom and ability of the bolts to move as that wood expands and contracts. Which should make sense, and that's all great, but still leaves the question of, how do these bolts actually hold the boards in place? The answer to that question has recently become one of my favorite ways to attach pieces together. So if you guessed that the next step of this build would be to recess threaded inserts down inside the pedestal, you'd be correct. While threaded inserts and furniture bolts are a fantastic way of joining pieces together that require wood movement, they can be tricky to use, mainly because of the precision required when setting everything up. And part of this is that those threaded inserts need to be as vertical or straight up and down as possible, which isn't always easy to do. I've seen a few jigs or drill guides made specific for this purpose, but unfortunately they can be a bit expensive. And a good substitution that I've found that works is just to use a doweling jig. So once those holes are drilled essentially straight up and down, we can very easily recess those inserts down inside of the pedestal. So if you've made it this far in the video and you've actually been paying attention the whole time, first of all, I want to applaud your attention span. But at this point, you've likely heard me say several times that this piece needs to be detachable or come apart with a reassembly process that's, at least to some degree, easy. So if you haven't managed to guess why that is, I'm sure you're curious. The answer to that question is the same reason that I'm assembling the bottom of the table exactly like I did the top section of the table. And the reason that I'm building the table this way is because this table is homeless. So the reason that this table is homeless is because I've been trying to get away from commission builds. And if you happen to watch my last video, you might understand why. Now, regardless of that information, what I actually mean by this table is homeless is that this piece is not a custom commission build, but rather something that I wanted to build. And really that's because I think I'm at a pivotal point in this woodworking journey that my main focus moving forward will be on the pieces that I want to build, rather than commission pieces. So I really wanted to save this information for the very end of the video, but since this piece is homeless, that means that it's for sale, and it's actually available at the link listed in the description on my Etsy site. Now, the reason that this piece needs to be detachable and come apart is because of shipping. What I mean by that is that if the entire base of the table does come apart, I'll be able to fit this in a much smaller box, saving money on shipping, which ultimately means a lower price for the table. So honestly, I'm still a little on the fence on the decision of if it's okay to ship this table out in multiple pieces, meaning that some assembly obviously will be required, but that's part of the whole design of this table. Considering that I designed and built this table, personally I think that assembling it is very easy, but I understand that that's not the case for everyone. So I am still deciding how I want to ship this thing, but it's nice to know that a smaller box might be an option. And if you have an opinion on if you'd rather receive this thing with some assembly required or all the way together, I'd love to hear your opinion in the comments. It should go without saying that a table base, no matter how fancy or cool it is pretty much useless without a tabletop. So if you weren't able to guess, this stack of boards will become the tabletop. Rather than attempt a large glue up with all the boards being glued together at once, I'll be gluing all these boards into 3 separate slab pieces, running them through the planer and then gluing those 3 pieces together. And one tip that I've really picked up on is to always cut more boards than you need, at least if you have enough lumber. And I say that because you may have noticed me flipping these boards over, looking down the edges and swapping a couple pieces out. And I have been burned way too many times over the past with only cutting the exact amount of boards that I need, and then one of those boards has a crack or the face grain looks terrible and needing to swap that out later on. So if you cut more boards than you need, it's much easier to trade out the bad ones for a better looking board. In this case at the tabletop, that top surface is made from 10 total boards, but I cut either 14 or 15 out. And it just so happened that a couple of those boards had a crack in the middle and some visible sapwood in the grain that looked much better after I traded all the boards out. So at this point, all the glue is dry, thankfully, meaning that I won't ruin another shirt. And like I mentioned earlier, I'll be taking advantage of my wider planer to plane down and smooth out the surfaces, saving me a little time on the sanding after this glue up is finally finished. While I'm typically pretty good at gluing up tabletops, I still often use dominoes or some other means of alignment tool to line these slabs up since they're now way too big to run through my planer. If you're wondering why I'm using a domino instead of a biscuit joiner or maybe dowels, really it's just because it's faster, but either one of those other options would do the same exact thing. When it comes to woodworking, or at least watching woodworking videos, it seems like everybody likes to talk about the part of woodworking that they hate. Usually you'll hear that is sanding. And I certainly don't disagree that sanding is terrible, but in this video, we'll focus on the positives and the good parts of woodworking rather than the sanding and the bad parts. While it has definitely been quite some time since I cut my first circular table with a router, this remains one of my absolute favorite things to do in woodworking. So if we are to say that sanding is the worst, cutting out large circular tabletops with a router is the best. It may look complicated if you've never done this, but really all you need to do is attach your router to a fixed board with a pivot point in the center of the tabletop that you want to cut. And once everything is set up, you just pivot that router in a circle, making several shallow passes, and you'll often see people switching over to a flush trim bit towards the end, but everything was going smoothly, so I just plunged all the way through. The fine details of this build, such as a small round over on the table edge and properly sanding to not leave any swirl marks, which I've learned my lesson several times, are the points of emphasis that'll really make this table feel high quality when it's finished. And another important point, which we've mentioned several times in this video, is wood movement. For that reason, it should be no surprise that we'll once again use the domino to cut elongated slots in the top supports, and then secure the tabletop in place using threaded inserts and furniture bolts. It seems like everyone these days, or everyone on YouTube anyways, seems to love Rubio Monocoat. and I'm no exception to that, but you may not be familiar with a cheaper alternative called Natura One Coat. This product behaves almost exactly like Rubio, and honestly I'm not sure what the difference is other than price point. So if you're wondering why I'm using this instead of Rubio, that's just because I was out of Rubio and had a can of this. But honestly, at least on maple, I think their clear color looks a little better than Rubio Pure, as it holds the natural color of the maple just a little better, at least in my opinion. Now, everything that I've just said might make me a hypocrite because after this stain is dry, I'll come back a couple days later and use Rubio's maintenance oil to make the color pop a little and give the finish some extra sheen. And for whatever reason that I still don't know, I thought it was a good idea to assemble the table before applying that maintenance oil, which you'll see in a minute I ended up taking back apart to put the maintenance oil on the tabletop. So as I reassemble this table, attach the tabletop, put the maintenance oil on, and then ironically disassemble the table, we still need to address the elephant in the room, which is the question of, is this table worth $2,500? Now, at this point in my woodworking career, I don't really feel the need to justify my price or value to anyone, but for the sake of the video at least, we need to think about the cost of materials, which include the wood obviously, the time to pick up the wood, the finish, maintenance oil, nano coating, glue, sandpaper, and most importantly to me, my time that went into this table. So that final figure is roughly based off of all the material costs as well as an hourly rate that I think my time is worth. But as the age-old saying goes, it's worth what someone is willing to pay. Now, I'll probably never claim that any piece I build is 100% perfect or a complete masterpiece. But in an attempt to be completely transparent and offer my insight on this piece, I think this may have been the best job on a build that I've ever done, and hopefully the final shots at the end of the video will show that. So if you do think this piece is worth the price and you can't live without it, once again it is available for purchase at the link in the description. And if you don't feel that it's worth the value, let's just ask the question. If you were the creator of this piece, what price would you be happy with? Hopefully, we'll be able to find out the answer to that question together, and someone will end up owning the table of their dreams. Thanks for watching.